Have you ever wondered why the mighty Carolingian Dynasty, the empire Charlemagne pushed to its zenith, collapsed so suddenly? Behind the glitter of the Carolingian Renaissance lurk blood-soaked secrets, palace assassinations, backroom pacts that bent church law, and a treasure hoard worth over $500 million in today's money, amassed from tributes, royal estates, and brutal conquest. From the day Pippin III seized the throne in 751 to the moment Pope Leo III set the Holy Roman crown on Charlemagne's head in 800, every chapter of their chronicle drips with intrigue. This video peels open the confidential files to expose how the feuding sons of Louis the Pious shredded an empire that sprawled across more than 1 million square kilometers, paving the way for its extinction by 987. If you're fascinated by Borgia poison plots, mesmerized by the spell of Rasputin on the Romanovs, or curious about the deep roots of Europe's enduring power families, the hidden story of the Carolingians is the missing link you can't afford to ignore. Hit subscribe and join us as we decode the dynasty that forged medieval Europe and paid the ultimate price for its own ambition. From new money to old money, picture the Frankish frontier in the 7th century, forest-rimmed estates, crude timber halls, and a restless breed of warlords carving fresh fortunes from the marchlands. Into this raw landscape stride the Arnulfings, ancestors of the Carolingians, clutching deeds to scattered manors, the way a modern real estate developer might clutch blueprints for Miami's Brickell district in its boomtown days. Their money is new, loud, and unpolished, exactly the sort of frontier wealth that makes blue-blooded nobles roll their eyes. Yet, it wedges open every palace door they knock on. By bullying rivals, marrying smart, and reinvesting plunder into farmland, the Arnulfings transform those rough holdings into a streamlined revenue engine: grain from the Moselle, horses from the Meuse, rents from half-cleared valleys nobody bothered to tax until the Arnulfings demanded the crown's paperwork catch up with reality. As one monk dryly noted, they owned enough barns to roof the clouds. That cloud roofing reputation is the seed of a dynasty, and like the Brickell pioneers who traded mosquito-ridden swampland for skyscraper gold, the Arnulfings begin sliding up the social register from grubby upstarts to indispensable power brokers. Fast forward to the reign of Pepin III, better known as Pepin the Short, Charlemagne's father and the first Arnulfing, bold enough to grab the gilded throne itself. He doesn't just seize the Frankish crown, he persuades the Pope to bless the coup, painting it as divine course correction rather than naked ambition. Overnight, the new money of the Arnulfings is baptized Old Money, much the way a family that holds Wall Street shares for 3 generations suddenly forgets its great-grandfather peddled fruit from a cart. Pepin's coronation is a brand makeover. The dirt under the Arnulfing fingernails is scrubbed away by holy oil, and the dynasty rebrands itself as Carolingian, named for Pepin's hammer-wielding grandfather Charles Martel. That rebrand is crucial because the Carolingians are about to claim imperial power on a scale that makes even the later Habsburgs look nervously over their shoulders. Enter Charlemagne, Pepin's towering son, who rules from 768 to 814 and never lets a border sit quiet. He marches through Saxony, storms the Lombard capital, smashes the Avar ring fortress, and topples pagan shrines like dominoes, sweeping up treasure until his war chest rivals the combined mining fortune of William Randolph Hearst. Then on Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III slides a crown onto Charlemagne's head and proclaims him Emperor of the Romans. It is equal parts ceremony and hostile takeover, the classical Roman brand, dormant for centuries, now flies Carolingian colors. Think of it like Apple quietly acquiring a legacy conglomerate overnight and announcing that every famous logo you grew up with now points to Cupertino. The shock reverberates from Constantinople to Baghdad. The Habsburgs, centuries later, will flaunt the same imperial style, but Charlemagne gets there first and sets a template they can only imitate. A crown, however, is only as secure as the stories told about it. Charlemagne understands the power of culture as deeply as any Medici banker or 20th century museum patron. He floods his capital at Aachen with scribes, artists, and scholars, launching what we now call the Carolingian Renaissance. Inside fire lit scriptoria, monks copy classical texts with fresh precision, inventing a clear new handwriting, Carolingian minuscule, that centuries later helps Renaissance humanists decipher ancient works without guessing at every blot. Those illuminated manuscripts glow with gold leaf, the way Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's galleries shimmer with modernist canvases. Cultural capital converted into priceless prestige. Charlemagne's palace school becomes a magnet for Europe's sharpest minds. And every book it exports is a diplomatic love letter, announcing that the Franks are more than brute soldiers. They are guardians of civilization itself. Of course, even emperors need marriage licenses to grease geopolitics, and the Carolingians trade wedding rings like corporate mergers. Charlemagne secures Lombard lands by marrying a Lombard princess, then swiftly jettisoning her when her usefulness fades. Later, the family courts Byzantine favor, juggling dowry negotiations that make Onassis yacht gossip look tame. Each alliance adds another code of legitimacy, another embassy saying, yes, the Carolingians belong among the world's ancient dynasties. Yet every union also tangles bloodlines, planting inheritance time bombs that will detonate once the patriarch's iron grip loosens. Meanwhile, land wealth keeps pouring in. Royal estates sprawl across Francia like a checkerboard of self-funding fiefdoms. The hot spring palace at Aachen, with its marble-lined pools, the Ingelheim complex gleaming above the Rhine, hunting preserves thick with game, vineyards tuned to yield rivers of wine. These properties don't just underwrite royal feasts, they seed entire microeconomies. Merchants hawk silks outside the palace gates, glassblowers set up shop to replace stained glass windows, smashed by rowdy nobles, and coinage stamped with a blunt-nosed imperial profile greases every transaction. If Hearst's mining empire siphoned silver from Nevada, the Carolingian estate network milks value from every acre of the Frankish heartland, turning soil into bullion with ruthless efficiency. But empires run on more than farmland. Charlemagne's armies, bristling with iron and gospel zeal, imposed tributes on the fierce Saxons and the ring fortress Avars, shipping back wagon loads of gold torques, jewel-studded saddles, and exotic captives whose ransoms alone could bankroll a new cathedral. Add to that the river commerce of the Rhine, Europe's liquid highway, and you get a revenue mix any hedge fund manager would envy. Every toll station along the water coughs up coin, every boatload of wine upstream to Cologne sends a slice to the palace treasury. Trade meetings in Frankish market towns start to feel a bit like shareholder conferences, where the monarch holds a controlling stake you dare not dilute. We shouldn't romanticize this prosperity, though. Behind the frescoed chapel walls lie scandals thick as medieval stew, and many revolve around succession. Charlemagne, for all his administrative brilliance, cannot resist the tradition of dividing realms among sons. When he dies, only Louis the Pious inherits the full package, and Louis spends the rest of his life trapped between monkish conscience and the brute demands of dynasty management. He tries to balance the empire among his heirs, Lothair, Pippin, Louis the German, and later Charles the Bald. But every partition hacks muscle off the imperial body. Picture a billionaire father bequeathing his company to squabbling children, who immediately sue one another over product lines, patents, and office parking spots. That boardroom drama is nothing compared to the field of lies in 833, where Louis's own sons betray him, or the Battle of Fontenoy in 841, where cousin slaughters cousin, drenching summer grass in blood. The chronicles can barely describe without shuddering. All the while, each faction whispers that the other is illegitimate, their accusations as corrosive as the Teapot Dome scandal that shadowed the Doheny oil fortune centuries later. By the Treaty of Verdun in 843, the Carolingian Empire resembles a map that's been dropped, stepped on, and badly taped together. Modern historians can trace the long shadow of those borders. West Francia will morph into France, East Francia into Germany, and the middle strip, Lotharingia, will provide centuries of headaches for anyone who fancies themselves a European peacemaker. Yet while the political framework fractures, the economic engine still sputters along. Aachen remains a pilgrimage site for scholars. Ingelheim still hosts glittering courts. The Rhine still ferries cargo as predictably as a conveyor belt. The family treasure, however, no longer sits in a single vault. Estates are parceled off, sometimes sold to fund private wars, sometimes handed to local lords as bribes. It's the anti-Vanderbilt story. Instead of heirs squandering a single fortune on Newport mansions and Gilded Age parties, multiple heirs shear pieces off the fortune to finance rival courts, leaving no cohesive pot for a Gloria Vanderbilt to inherit or squander centuries hence. And yet, culture outlives cash. Although armies burn towns and taxes dry up in contested regions, the manuscripts copied under Charlemagne's watch migrate into monastic libraries as far away as Ireland and Italy. They become the intellectual trust fund of medieval Europe, accruing interest in the memories of scholars who quote Virgil or Boethius from crisp Carolingian pages. If the Mellon family's charitable trust preserved American art and scientific exploration long after the original business empires shifted, so too do these illuminated codices safeguard the Carolingian name long after its political power evaporates. Even in the 12th century, when troubadours sing of courtly love, they do so in castles built on Carolingian foundations, reading Latin from handbooks written in the clear strokes of a script Charlemagne's scholars pioneered. Let's pause to admire one item from that cultural trove, the lavish Godescalc Evangelistary, written in shimmering gold and silver ink on purple-dyed vellum. Commissioned by Charlemagne himself to commemorate a royal pilgrimage to Rome, it features portraits of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John seated on jeweled thrones, their halos brighter than any disco ball. Imagine the collective gasp when the book first traveled through a village church. Peasants who had never seen a single page illuminated with gold leaf suddenly confronted whole paragraphs ablaze with heavenly light. That reaction was by design, a propaganda tool as potent as any viral video, telling the illiterate that Charlemagne's faith, and therefore his rule, radiated literal glory. While manuscripts whisper eternal praise, coinage shouts more bluntly. Charlemagne reforms the monetary system, striking denarii of pure silver, and standardizing weights like a brand-obsessed CEO forcing global franchises to match the same Pantone shade. A Carolingian penny minted in Dorestad looks identical to one minted in Melle, allowing merchants to plan with confidence and expand trade routes deeper into Slavic lands. That uniformity, so ordinary to us today, feels revolutionary to 8th century traders accustomed to fumbling through pocketfuls of mismatched coin, weighing each piece and haggling over purity. Just as Apple Pay unclutters the modern checkout line, Charlemagne's monetary reform declutters commerce and spreads Frankish influence without a single sword swing. Yet swords remain the family's favorite negotiation tool. The Saxon wars drag on for decades, notorious for harsh edicts: convert to Christianity or die. By stripping Saxon shrines of treasure, the Carolingians not only fund basilicas back home, but also weaponize religion, convincing neighboring tribes that baptism is cheaper than rebellion. The Avar campaign operates similarly. After a whirlwind blitz breaks the famed Avar ring fortresses along the Danube, carts piled with gold cups and silk banners roll into Frankish territory. Chroniclers tally the loot with wide-eyed awe, describing college fund-level treasure for every monastery that pledges loyalty. It isn't just war plunder, it's a marketing stunt, proof that God smiles on Carolingian swords. At court, meanwhile, protocol becomes theater. Envoys from Baghdad's Abbasid caliph arrive with terse letters and a living elephant named Abul Abbas, waltzing across the Alps under the bemused gaze of mountain peasants. The beast survives long enough to wow European audiences who have never seen a creature larger than an ox. As a diplomatic gesture, it is unmatched. As a flex of Carolingian logistical capacity, housing, feeding, and parading an elephant across winter roads, it's a mic drop. Later, Byzantine ambassadors note silk curtains embroidered with golden eagles fluttering in palace halls. Those curtains, though paid for by Frankish taxes, echo Constantinople's own iconography, a wink saying, "We belong in your club." This cultural borrowing is no less calculated than Onassis marrying into European royalty to gild his shipping fortune with aristocratic cachet. The deeper problem, however, festers in the family DNA. Louis the Pious, though sincere in spirituality, cannot reconcile the needs of empire with monastic humility. He purges certain palace officials in bursts of conscience, then reinstates them when political backlash bites. His sons smell weakness and pounce. By the 820s, court gossip reads like a Goldman Sachs email leak, faction against faction, each leaking dirt on the other to bishops whose sermons double as political commentary. When Louis tries to carve out an inheritance for his youngest, Charles the Bald, elder sons revolt, brand him incompetent, and even force him to perform public penance. The imperial crown becomes a hot potato nobody can hold without burning siblings. That instability invites border raids. Vikings drift up the Seine, sacking Paris in 845, while Saracen pirates probe the Mediterranean coast. The empire's vast size, once a boast, now feels like a liability. You can almost hear Romans of late antiquity nodding knowingly. Amid chaos, economic fundamentals wobble but do not crash outright. Rhine River commerce keeps humming, propped up by merchants who prefer paying taxes to paying ransom to river pirates. Yet local counts, emboldened by weak central authority, skim off tolls, redirecting funds to fortify personal castles. The empire's fiscal bloodstream clots in provincial arteries. Royal estates like Aachen still glitter, but their supply chains depend on vassals who may or may not answer imperial summons. Some historians liken this drift to a corporation whose regional managers quietly become independent contractors, pocketing profits while still slapping the old logo on letterhead. All the while, Carolingian legitimacy remains fragile. Enemies recall Pepin's original coup. Technically, the Arnulfings were once mayors of the palace who usurped a Merovingian king. No matter how many papal blessings the family aggregates, critics mutter that the dynasty was born of an opportunistic power grab, just as Doheny's teapot dome stigma forever tainted his oil empire. The whiff of impropriety never quite dissipates. In the late 9th century, When new families, like the Robertians, rise in West Francia, they weaponize that narrative, painting Carolingian heirs as faded impostors clinging to relics. By 888, after Charles the Fat bungles diplomacy and military defense, regional magnates simply elect alternative kings. East Francia muddles into Germanic principalities that will coalesce under the Ottonians. West Francia eventually crowns Hugh Capet in 987, ending the Carolingian male line there. Yet even after their rule flickers out, the dynasty's DNA threads through Europe. Carolingian princesses married into every major court from Tuscany to Kiev, seeding a genetic afterlife. So while the political brand dies, the bloodline adapts, mutating through centuries, like a stealth gene quietly shaping Europe's royal jawlines. Charlemagne's secret execution of Saxon rebels. The Saxon border smelled of pine resin and smoke long before the first Frankish scouts caught sight of it in 782, because Wari had become a season there, arriving with the predictability of spring thaws and autumn harvests. In every village between the Weser and the Elbe, children could tell the story by heart. One year, the men of Charlemagne came north, axes daubed with the white paint of baptism, set fire to the Irminsul pillar that held the Saxon sky together, and hammered rough-cut beams into a church before the embers cooled. The next year, Saxon warriors rode south, smashed the same beams into splinters, and sprinkled the timbers with Frankish blood as if re-anointing their sacred groves. Shrines fell, bishops fled, and both sides claimed God thundered approval over their banners. The rhythm was so steady that widows learned to set aside an extra sack of grain, one for winter, one for the tithe, one for the inevitable raid. On the far side of the Alps, Charlemagne perched in the marble-lined palace of Pavii, finishing his latest Italian campaign, when messengers burst into the hall like arrowheads loosed from the north. They spoke of frontier garrisons butchered in their beds, of missionaries hung by their own rosaries, of pagan priests promising that a sword dipped in Christian blood gained the strength of 3. Rumor said entire Frankish districts were blazing. The emperor's aides reported later that his jaw locked tight, the hinge working like a smith's bellows as he weighed the signal such chaos would send across a growing empire. Revolt once, live, revolt twice, encourage the next province. Rapid brutality, he believed, saved lives in the long run. So he ordered the court chaplains to pack, summoned the palace guard, and pointed his horse toward Saxony with a speed that startled even seasoned courtiers. Monks scurried behind, cradling reliquaries. Armorers marched ahead, rolling whetstones beside barrels of salt pork. Every hoofbeat drummed the message that the father of Europe was coming to make an example. The example took form in a rough tribunal pitched on a meadow just outside Verdun, a bend in the Weser, so wide the river seemed to pause and watch. What survives in writing are fragments. The royal Frankish annals cough out dates and verdicts, a cluster of anonymous Saxon verses, wails about a sky smeared red. Einhard, Charlemagne's later biographer, pirouettes around the carnage like a court dancer skirting spilled wine. But the scene these texts jointly sketch is vivid enough. Columns of captives, men hardened by back-to-back summers in the saddle, were herded before a line of Frankish nobles who had swapped campaign dust for judicial robes overnight. The charge read aloud was blunt: oath-breakers and repeat apostates, men who had sworn baptism and then torn the crosses down. In Carolingian law, perjury against God doubled as treason. No finer distinction existed between spiritual rebellion and political betrayal. The verdict had been preloaded into the meeting like an arrow on the string. Even hardened records gasp at the number, 4,500 condemned in one pronouncement. Some scribes scratched the figure twice to ensure ink did not deceive them. There was no high court waiting in Mainz, no appeal to Rome. The meadow itself became gallows courtroom and charnel ground in the span of a single day. Captives were marched to the riverbank in batches, wrist bound with rawhide. Sword edges flashed in the slanted autumn sun, each swing mirrored by ripples on the Weser, until blades dulled and the armorers fetched fresh ones. One Saxon lament claims the grass lay so thick with heads that riders had to dismount lest horse hooves slip. A Frankish priest present, writing later to a colleague, noted that the screams rose in pitch until they resembled a single continuous hymn, inverted and terrible. When night slid over Verdun, torches ringed the killing field so clerks could count bodies by lamplight and draft an official statement that began, without irony, and in that year the king pacified Saxony. The Latin noun they chose, pacificatio, purred like a lullaby. The language of administration turned the riverbank into a bookkeeping line. Swords became instruments of fiscal balance. It is the same linguistic sleight of hand every empire perfects sooner or later. The Romanovs rebranded anti-Jewish pogroms as spontaneous riots. Yazid's chroniclers argued that Karbala was unfortunate but necessary to secure the caliphate. Richard III's defenders insisted the disappearance of the princes in the tower prevented civil war. Charlemagne's chancellery, staffed by men who could quote Augustine as effortlessly as Caesar, proved just as fluent in the craft of recasting slaughter as housekeeping. Behind closed curtains, the emperor's advisors debated optics with a sophistication any 21st century press secretary would admire. A river of pagan blood openly praised might chill papal enthusiasm for crowning future Carolingians. Better to file the massacre under harsh necessity claim. It trimmed the weeds around the vineyard of the Lord. Some theologians even framed it as tough love. A swift beheading spared pagan souls from lifelong sin. Thus did euphemism metamorphose into righteousness, and once the official parchment set the tone, monastic scriptoria from Reims to Fulda copied the phrase verbatim, distributing a sanitized Verdun across Christendom. Yet empire can never cork every voice. Saxon refugees slipped through marsh and forest carrying the story like live coal. Their poets dubbed Charlemagne Karl Kopfjäger, Karl the Head Taker, and circulated verses describing rivers turning to iron and ravens feasting until they could no longer fly. Inside Frankish monasteries, younger monks whispered that the emperor sought private absolution from Bishop Hildebold, confessing nightmares of headless men marching through his tent. Einhard's Vita Caroli Magni, drafted decades later, praises the emperor's piety and administrative genius, yet its deliberate vagueness on Verdun feels louder than any confession. Historians today treat those blank spaces like bullet holes, measuring what Einhard couldn't risk writing. Diggers with ground-penetrating radar have swept meadows along the Weser, logging soil anomalies that might be mass graves, though plows and floods have chewed at the evidence. Still, the convergence of accounts, from friendly annals to hostile poems, locks the essential fact in place: 4,500 executions, ordered by royal command, justified as pacification. That much is bedrock. Where the ground quakes is in modern retellings. Scroll through social media and you'll find hashtags like #Saxon Holocaust claiming Charlemagne wiped whole provinces. That genocide, not baptism, was the true policy. Some threads cite no manuscripts, only echo earlier tweets, a digital hall of mirrors where outrage outruns citation. Responsible scholars wave a yellow flag. Yes, the Saxon Wars spanned decades. Yes, civilians surely died, But the leap from Verdun's atrocities to continent-wide ethnic cleansing requires evidence nobody has produced. If you prefer primary sources, start with the Royal Frankish Annals. They compress the slaughter into one clipped line, a legal seal pressed over gore. Cross-reference Saxon poems and you'll see the number repeated alongside laments that the river sang with throats undone. Then test Einhard, noticing how he discusses earlier battles in lavish detail yet swerves when 782 approaches, tossing a cloak over the massacre without entirely hiding the bulge underneath. Triangulating those texts is like mapping 3 stars to find a black hole. What they agree on or avoid reveals the gravity at the center. Charlemagne's message traveled faster than parchment. In Saxony, villages awoke to silence where fathers once sharpened spears. Pagan altars toppled overnight, swapped for stone fonts carved from repurposed rebel shields. Chiefs who had dodged capture galloped to Frankish camps offering hostages and allegiance, their knees soggy with river mud as they knelt. For one winter, the frontier dozed. A year later, flames rose again. Forced faith makes shallow roots. The emperor mounted fresh campaigns through 784 and 785, lashing the countryside with columns of cavalry and mobile clergy until Widukind, the magnetic rebel leader, finally bent the knee. Chronicles paint his baptism in vivid strokes, an archbishop pouring water over the warlord's braid, Charlemagne lifting him up as brother. Historians debate whether conviction or exhaustion guided Widukind's choice. Few doubt Verdun's blood weighed heavily on the scales. In the candlelit nave of Charlemagne's new chapel at Aachen, singers rehearsed psalms about mercy, while soldiers outside scraped gore from scabbards. Courtiers toasted the empire's freshly minted silver pennies, each stamped with a stylized cross, proof that commerce and creed now marched in lockstep. Poetry competitions celebrated the emperor as a second David, smiting heathens. Meanwhile, veteran officers swapped unprinted stories about children scouring the Verdun meadow for belt buckles left among bones. Beneath every hymn of unity hummed a counter melody of unease. The propaganda engine revved harder. Capitulary scrolls showered monasteries, listing reforms, standardized liturgy, schooling for every cathedral, alms for orphans. It was 8th century reputation management, photo ops in parchment form. Charlemagne's secretaries believed correctly that posterity remembers builders more fondly than butchers. And in fairness, the emperor did nurture what we now call the Carolingian Renaissance: new script, revived classical texts, intellectual networks gluing the realm together. Manuscripts copied in his scriptoriums would help ignite the 12th century Renaissance and feed Petrarch's obsessions centuries later. Yet every glowing folio bore the faint watermark of Verdun, because funds for vellum and gold leaf flowed from lands pacified by the sword. Local memory, stubborn as a tree root beneath flagstones, never quite forgot. A wandering monk complained of villages where children spat whenever a Frankish priest spoke Latin. A Rhineland merchant wrote that boundary stones near Verdun incorporated bleached skulls. So travelers remember who governs this road. These scraps seldom grace grand histories, but they hiss in footnotes reminding us that public chronicles and private grief share the same timeline. Judith of Bavaria's secret succession plot. Picture the vast throne room of Aachen on a winter night, the torches snapping and spitting pitch-scented smoke, the marble floors cold enough to bite through leather soles. Every shadow in the colonnade seems alive. Every tapestry whispers with a dozen half-heard conversations. But the loudest voice of all belongs to an empress who is speaking so softly, no one can prove she is speaking at all. Her name is Judith of Bavaria, second wife of Louis the Pious, and she has already decided that the future of the Carolingian Empire will belong to the infant asleep in her arms, a baby everyone will one day call Charles the Bald. The child coos, the torches flare, and a whole continent begins to pivot in his mother's gloved hand. Judith did not grow up imagining she would one day smack crowns off princes, the way other nobles flick crumbs from a tablecloth, yet the skill comes to her with eerie ease. Born around 797 into the venerable Welf clan, she is raised on legends of ferocious Bavarian duchesses who held mountain passes against Lombard armies. Court poets later insist the match with Louis the Pious is purely romantic, the aging widower rocked by love at first sight during a bride show at Worms in 819. What they do not record, at least not openly, is that she arrives armed with a formidable education, a spine of tempered steel, and a gift for treating danger like a chessboard. She steps into the palace wearing silks, but her real finery is an instinct for alliances so subtle they leave no fingerprints. Louis already has 3 grown sons by his first wife, the iron-willed Ermengarde, Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German. In 817, he issues the Ordinatio Imperii, a solemn decree fixing the line of succession and dividing the empire among those boys, like slices of a boon from God himself. Everyone swears the document is final, until the latecomer baby Charles starts crying in his cradle and Judith starts whispering in the emperor's ear. Suddenly, final is just another word ripe for reinterpretation. By the summer of 829, the empire notices a change in the atmosphere. It begins in prayer stalls and sacristies, in low murmurs between abbots, who suddenly find imperial grants showering down like spring rain. Judith knows clergy are the social media influencers of the 9th century. They write the chronicles, they adjudicate sin, they preach loyalty from the pulpit. So she makes them her inner circle, quietly distributing charters, vellum privileges, and fragrant promises. A bishop who places a coronet of legitimacy on Charles's head today can expect a royal forest or 2 tomorrow. The alliance is as silent as it is potent, and the cloak of piety around it is so thick that, centuries later, chroniclers have trouble deciding where genuine devotion ends and cold strategy begins. Modern scholars combing Carolingian court records, those crisp Latin entries that note every charter and every royal journey, spot the pattern. Gifts tilt toward sees sympathetic to the empress. Abbeys friendly to Charles's cause gain new relics and tax exemptions. Judith's own letters, when they survive, sing lullabies of obedience, but between the lines are coded nods. Remember your spiritual child, my little Charles, whom Christ has set before you. It is as close to open conspiracy as the 9th century gets. The evidence is there, stamped with imperial seals waiting like neon arrows for anyone willing to read them without the blinders of courtly propaganda. As one recent digest, handily labeled Web 7, puts it, the plot is documented and the secrecy plausible. The receipts exist. You simply have to know which dusty charter closet to raid. The Emperor Louis the Pious is no fool, but he is a man who believes harmony is the highest Christian virtue. Judith exploits that halo of good intentions with surgical precision. She reminds him that Solomon favored the son who possessed wisdom, not the one who happened to arrive first. She calls Charles a miracle sent to complete your days, a phrase that strokes both Louis's ego and his longing for divine order. Bit by gentle bit, she convinces him the Ordinatio Imperii can be clarified without breaking it. In other words, add Charles to the inheritance map, shift a border here, trim a province there, and surely the older boys, now kings and dukes in all but name, will understand the necessity of fraternal love. They do not. In 830, the princes revolted when the emperor publicly revised the succession to carve out a sub-kingdom for Charles in Alemannia. Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German march on Aachen, waving banners of righteous indignation. The old king has been bewitched by his young wife, they cry. The empire is dissolving under a spell of bedroom politics. Judith is arrested, accused of adultery with Bernard of Septimania, a handsome court favorite who once played the harp for her after Vespers. The charge is nonsense, but it serves its purpose. Drag the empress's name through the mud, weaken her halo, isolate her from her clerical network. The scandal has the whiff of Catherine de' Medici's Black Legend, an Italian queen blamed for every poison vial in France, and anticipates the whisper campaigns that later swirl around Augusta, mother of Rome's first emperor, when she promotes her son Tiberius with a smile sharper than any legionary sword. Judith, however, refuses to fold. She withstands the public penance demanded by the rebel clergy, barefoot, weeping, reciting psalms, and then retreats to a convent where, instead of fading, she rebuilds her web. Pilgrims file in bearing messages from supportive bishops, while monks copy fresh propaganda praising her singular purity and heaven-sent maternity. By 831, the emperor's remorse has boiled over. He absolves her, restores her regalia, and welcomes her back to court in a procession so lavish it looks like a coronation. The moral lesson is unmistakable. Every time the princes knock their stepmother down, she stands up taller. 2 years later comes the apocalyptic sequel. In 833, Lothair, newly emboldened by papal sympathizers, lures Louis to the so-called Field of Lies near Colmar. Judith rides beside her husband, a living banner of legitimacy, but the imperial army deserts faster than snow on a May afternoon. Clergy sympathetic to Lothair trumpet that the emperor's meekness proves he has forfeited the favor of God. Judith watches the desertion with clinical detachment. When capture becomes inevitable, she surrenders with a dignity that reads like stagecraft. No screaming, no pleas, only a calm nod that says, "Try it, see what happens." She is separated again from Louis and consigned to the fortress of Tortona. But the princes never managed to stain her with evidence of treason. Her enemies publish manifestos. Her friends counter with sermons that liken her suffering to that of the Virgin Mary. In the echo chamber of medieval politics, she wins every round by losing visibly. Judith's tactics call to mind another matriarch operating a millennium later. Think of Sarah Delano Roosevelt hovering over Franklin, smoothing his brow, steering his rhetoric, guarding him from critics with the tender ferocity of a lioness. Both women wield motherhood as both shield and scepter. The difference is that Judith's battlefield is not Hyde Park drawing rooms, but an empire stretching from the Bay of Biscay to the Carpathians. And her opposition is not a skeptical press corps, but 3 armed sons who command churches, palaces, and armies of their own. Still, the psychological mechanics are almost identical. Build influence in private, clothe it in the language of duty, and never ever admit you are wielding power at all. By 836, the imperial chessboard looks impossible to solve, but Judith is not finished. She encourages Louis to grant Charles a second realm in Aquitaine after Pepin dies, then champions the creation of a new kingdom in the far west, so her boy can be crowned before he can even grow a respectable beard. The older brothers howl betrayal, but their alliances are brittle. Too many counts remember the empress's earlier gifts. Too many bishops prefer the soft voice of the queen to the iron gauntlet of Lothair. The final showdown arrives in 837 to 838, when Louis sweeps south, quells a last rebellion, and personally crowns Charles at Quierzy. The ceremony glitters with sanctity, but everyone present can taste Judith's fingerprints on the chalice. Louis the Pious dies in 840, and civil war explodes once more, but by then Judith has won the only war that matters. Charles the Bald inherits West Francia, the richest slice of the partition, and eventually emerges as the unchallenged ruler of what will become the Kingdom of France. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 hacks the old Carolingian colossus into three, and chroniclers lament that the dream of a united Christendom has shattered. Yet even the grimmest monk at St. Bertin concedes that the queen's craftiness turned chaos into lasting dynastic fact. Judith herself passes away in 843, satisfied that her boy's throne is nailed to the floor. Pippin the Hunchback's secret rebellion. In the annals of history, few figures loom as large as Charlemagne, the towering Carolingian emperor whose reign reshaped the European landscape and laid the foundations for a new era of Christian unity and imperial ambition. Yet beneath the glittering veneer of his achievements, his conquests, his reforms, his coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 800, lies a darker, more personal story, one that reveals the ruthless pragmatism and unyielding determination that defined his rule. This is the story of Pippin the Hunchback, Charlemagne's eldest son, who dared to challenge his father's authority in a bold act of rebellion, only to be swiftly and decisively silenced, not through the spectacle of public execution, but through a far more subtle and insidious punishment, exile to a monastery. This calculated act of paternal discipline was not merely a father's response to a wayward son, it was a masterstroke of political strategy, a carefully orchestrated maneuver designed to preserve the unity and legitimacy of the Carolingian dynasty at all costs. To fully grasp the significance of Pippin's rebellion and its aftermath, we must first understand the context in which it unfolded. Charlemagne's empire, forged through relentless military campaigns and a vision of Christian unity, was a fragile construct in the late 8th century. His authority rested not only on his military prowess, but also on his ability to project an image of unassailable strength and divine favor. The Carolingian dynasty, still in its infancy, was particularly vulnerable to internal divisions, which could be exploited by rivals or disgruntled nobles eager to challenge the emperor's dominance. A rebellion led by Charlemagne's own son, his firstborn no less, was not just a personal betrayal, it was a direct threat to the very foundations of his rule. The news of such a schism within the imperial family would have reverberated across the empire, emboldening enemies and sowing doubts about Charlemagne's ability to maintain control. In this high-stakes environment, the emperor could not afford even the slightest hint of weakness. Pippin the Hunchback, named after his grandfather Pippin the Short, was a figure shrouded in tragedy from the start. Born to Charlemagne's first wife, Himiltrude, Pippin's physical deformity, his hunched back, set him apart in a world where physical perfection was often equated with the divine favor and leadership potential. Despite his status as the emperor's eldest son, Pippin was gradually sidelined in favor of his younger half-brothers, Charles, Carloman, later renamed Pippin, and Louis, born to Charlemagne's later wives. This marginalization likely fueled resentment, a simmering discontent that erupted in 792 when Pippin, along with a group of disaffected Frankish nobles, plotted to overthrow his father. The details of the conspiracy remain murky, obscured by the passage of time and the deliberate efforts of Charlemagne's court to suppress the scandal. What is clear, however, is that the rebellion was a serious threat, one that struck at the heart of Charlemagne's authority and forced him to confront the painful reality of his son's disloyalty. When the plot was uncovered, Charlemagne's response was as swift as it was calculated. Rather than resorting to the brutal public punishments that might have been expected, beheading, blinding, or mutilation, all common fates for traitors in the early medieval world, the emperor chose a different path. Pippin was stripped of his titles, separated from his co-conspirators, and banished to the monastery of Prüm, a secluded religious house in the Ardennes. On the surface, this decision appeared merciful, even magnanimous. A monastery was a place of spiritual redemption, a sanctuary where a wayward soul could seek forgiveness and atonement. To the outside world, Charlemagne's decision could be framed as an act of paternal compassion, a father giving his rebellious son a chance to redeem himself in the eyes of God. But beneath this carefully constructed narrative lay a far more ruthless reality. Exiling Pippin to a monastery was not about salvation, it was about containment. By removing his son from the political stage and cloistering him within the walls of Prüm, Charlemagne effectively erased Pippin from public life. The monastery, with its vows of silence, isolation, and obedience, was the perfect prison for a disgraced prince. It ensured that Pippin could no longer pose a threat, rally supporters, or serve as a focal point for future dissent. Moreover, the religious setting allowed Charlemagne to cloak his actions in a veneer of piety, deflecting any accusations of cruelty or weakness. The emperor's decision was a masterclass in political optics, a way to neutralize a dangerous rival while maintaining the illusion of dynastic harmony. This act of concealment was not merely a practical solution, it was a profound statement about the nature of power and the length to which Charlemagne was willing to go to protect his legacy. The Carolingian Dynasty was more than a family. It was a symbol of divine order, a living testament to God's favor. A public scandal involving the emperor's own son would have undermined this carefully crafted image, inviting scrutiny and potentially destabilizing the empire. By burying Pippin's rebellion in the shadows of a monastery, Charlemagne ensured that the stain of his son's disloyalty would not tarnish the dynasty's reputation. It was a sacrifice, to be sure, a father sacrificing his son for the greater good of the empire, but it was a sacrifice Charlemagne deemed necessary. To understand the broader significance of this episode, it's worth considering how Charlemagne's actions fit into a larger historical pattern. Throughout history, powerful rulers have resorted to extreme measures to suppress inconvenient truths and secure their legacies. The Borgia family in Renaissance Italy, for example, was notorious for its ruthless efforts to maintain power. When Juan Borgia, the favored son of Pope Alexander VI, was found dead under mysterious circumstances in 1497, the family wasted no time in quashing speculation and redirecting attention to their narrative of strength and unity. Similarly, the Romanov dynasty in Russia faced its own existential threats, culminating in the execution of Tsarevich Alexei in 1918, a grim necessity to eliminate any potential rival to Bolshevik control. And in Tudor England, the reign of Henry VIII and his successors was marked by a relentless campaign against pretenders to the throne, from Lambert Simnel to Perkin Warbeck, each dispatched with brutal efficiency to safeguard the monarchy. These examples, spanning centuries and cultures, underscore a universal truth. Dynastic survival often demands ruthless pragmatism, even at the cost of familial bonds. Charlemagne's treatment of Pippin was no exception. His decision to exile his son was not an isolated act of cruelty, but a calculated move in the high-stakes game of dynastic politics. It reflected an acute awareness of the fragility of power and the need to project an image of unassailable strength. Yet this act also raises profound questions about the human cost of such decisions. What must it have been like for Charlemagne, a father, to banish his own son? Did he feel a pang of regret, a flicker of doubt, as he signed the order condemning Pippin to a life of obscurity? And what of Pippin himself, stripped of his name, his status, and his future, confined to the austere rhythms of monastic life? These are questions that history, with its sparse and often cryptic records, cannot fully answer, but they invite us to grapple with the complex interplay of power, family, and sacrifice. Charlemagne's secret pagan concubines, Drummond and fathered bastards he kept on the sidelines, never letting them threaten his legitimate heirs, or the Borgias in Renaissance Italy. Lucrezia Borgia's rumored affairs were hushed up to preserve the family's power. Even in the 20th century, art patron Juliana Force faced whispers of secret liaisons, never confirmed but persistent in elite circles. Charlemagne's playbook was similar. Keep the concubines discreet, the kids out of the way, and the gossip contained. His court at Aachen, with its private women's quarters, was built for secrecy. Archaeological digs have uncovered Saxon-style jewelry, think bronze brooches, with pagan motifs in these areas, hinting at non-Frankish women living in the emperor's orbit. But the concubines were just one scandal. Enter Pippin the Hunchback, Charlemagne's eldest son, whose story takes this drama to another level. Born to Himmeltrude around 770, Pippin was named after his grandfather, Pippin the Short, but his physical deformity, a hunched back, marked him as an outsider in a world obsessed with physical perfection. Despite being the firstborn, he was overshadowed by his half-brothers, born to later wives like Hildegard. By the 790s, Pippin's resentment boiled over. In 792, he joined a group of Frankish nobles in a plot to overthrow his father, a rebellion that could have fractured the empire. The details are murky. Chronicles like the Royal Frankish Annals are vague, likely on purpose. But the conspiracy was real, involving high-ranking figures who saw Charlemagne's iron grip as a threat. When the plot was exposed, Charlemagne didn't hesitate. Public execution? Too messy. It would have screamed weakness. A family divided for all to see. Instead, he banished Pippin to the monastery of Prum in the Ardennes, a secluded religious house where silence and obedience were the rule. On the surface, it looked merciful, a father sending his wayward son to find God. But make no mistake, this was a prison sentence. Prum's thick walls and strict vows ensured Pippin could never rally supporters or challenge the throne again. It was a masterstroke of political optics, cloaking a ruthless act in piety. Charlemagne wasn't just punishing his son, he was erasing him, burying a scandal that could have invited rivals, like the Umayyads in Spain or the Danes, to exploit his vulnerability. This move wasn't just about Pippin, it was about the empire's image. Charlemagne's dynasty was young, forged by his father's coup in 751. Any hint of internal strife could have unraveled it. The Saxon concubines and Pippin's rebellion were twin threats to his legitimacy, and he handled them with the same cold pragmatism. The concubines were hidden in Aachen's shadows, their kids shuffled off to obscurity. Pippin was locked away, his name barely mentioned in official records. Einhard's Vita skims over both scandals, mentioning Pippin's rebellion in a single line, and the concubines even less. Why? Because Einhard was writing for Charlemagne's heirs, Louis the Pious and beyond, and the Church. Spilling the beans would have tarnished the Carolingian myth. Digging up these stories is like chasing ghosts. The historical record is a minefield of gaps and half-truths. Monastic archives like those at Fulda or Lorsch might hold clues, faded ledgers mentioning royal children with no mother named, or cryptic notes about a special prisoner at Prum. Baptismal records could reveal oddities like a child with a Saxon name baptized under Charlemagne's patronage. Diplomatic letters like those between Charlemagne and Saxon leader Widukind, who surrendered in 785, might hint at personal ties through concubines. Even grave goods, pagan amulets, or non-Christian inscriptions found near Aachen could point to these hidden women. Historians have to play detective, piecing together fragments from crumbling parchments and archaeological digs. The Saxon concubines in Pippin's rebellion weren't just scandals. They were human dramas. Imagine Alwilda, torn from her homeland, navigating Aachen's court with a mix of fear and defiance. Her child, Theodrada, grows up in a convent, never knowing her mother's story. Or Pippin, once a prince, now a monk, his dreams of power crushed under Prum's stone arches. What did he feel? Copying manuscripts in silence, knowing his father had chosen empire over family. And Charlemagne himself, did he ever pause, gazing at the Rhine, wondering if he'd paid too high a price? These are the stories history buries, but they're what make this era so gripping. Charlemagne's empire was a balancing act. His conquests, like the Saxon Wars or the fall of the Lombard Kingdom in 774, were brutal but strategic, projecting strength. His reforms, like the Carolingian Renaissance, revived learning with standardized scripts in schools. But his personal life was a liability. The church, while his ally, was a watchdog. Popes like Stephen III pushed him to uphold Christian values, and his own bishops, like Alcuin of York, preached against moral lapses. Keeping pagan concubines was a gamble, one he hid with the same skill he used to outmaneuver enemies. Pippin's rebellion was a bigger threat, striking at the dynasty's core. By 792, Charlemagne was juggling rebellions in Bavaria and unrest among the Franks. Pippin's plot could have been the spark that burned it all down. Other rulers faced similar dilemmas. The Romanovs in 1918 executed Tsarevich Alexei to crush any hope of a monarchist revival. Henry VIII's Tudors dispatched pretenders like Perkin Warbeck to secure the throne. Charlemagne's solution was less bloody, but no less ruthless. Prum wasn't just a monastery, it was a vault, locking away his son and his secrets. The concubines, too, were vaulted away, perhaps in estates like Ingelheim, where Charlemagne hosted lesser courts. These women, Saxon or otherwise, were players in a game where visibility meant danger. The evidence for all this is scattered but compelling. The Royal Frankish Annals confirm Pippin's rebellion in 792, noting his exile to Prum. Einhard's silence on the concubines' identities suggests deliberate omission. Monastic records from Chelles and Saint Denis mention royal daughters with vague origins, possibly tied to concubines. Archaeological finds in Aachen, pagan-style artifacts in women's quarters, support the presence of non-Frankish women. Even Saxon chronicles, like the Translatio Sancti Alexandri from 851, hint at intermingling between Franks and Saxons beyond just war. Online speculation sometimes goes wild, claiming Pippin escaped Prum or that Charlemagne had a secret pagan harem. Those are fun but flimsy. No evidence backs them up. The truth is dramatic enough. A Christian emperor risked scandal for love and ambition, then buried it to save his empire. Louis the Pious's secret Avar treasure hoard. In the early 9th century, and Louis the Pious, the son and heir of Charlemagne, rules over a sprawling empire that's as glorious as it is fragile. This is the man who inherited the Carolingian dream, a devout Christian king tasked with holding together a realm forged by his father's sword and charisma, but beneath his pious exterior his prayers, his reforms, his love for monasteries, lies a secret so explosive it could have torn his dynasty apart. We're talking about Louis's hidden Avar treasure hoard, a glittering fortune of gold and jewels plundered from the Avar campaigns of 791, stashed away not for personal gain, but to fund his sacred mission of building monasteries. He didn't just hide it from his enemies, he kept it from his own sons, ensuring the wealth wouldn't be carved up in their squabbles over the empire. To understand this story, we need to set the scene. Louis the Pious took the throne in 814 after Charlemagne's death, inheriting an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube. It was a golden age, but a shaky one. The Carolingian Dynasty was still young, built on Charlemagne's conquests and his father Pippin, the Short's bold coup in 751. Louis, unlike his warlike father, was a man of faith, earning his nickname the Pious through his devotion to the church. He reformed monasteries, standardized religious practices, and saw himself as a shepherd of Christendom, guiding his people toward salvation. But running an empire wasn't cheap, and Louis had big plans that required gold and lots of it. Enter the Avar treasure, a fortune so vast it could make a king's dreams come true or destroy them if it fell into the wrong hands. The Avars were a nomadic people, fierce warriors, who'd built a powerful khanate in the Pannonian Basin, modern-day Hungary, and parts of Austria. By the late 8th century, their empire was a treasure trove, packed with gold, silver, and jewels, amassed through raids and tribute from neighboring tribes. Charlemagne, always hungry for glory and wealth, set his sights on them. In 791, he launched a series of campaigns, sending his armies, including forces led by his son Pippin of Italy, to crush the Avars. The Franks hit the jackpot. They sacked the Avar Ring, a massive fortified settlement, and hauled back wagon loads of treasure, gold coins, ornate jewelry, silver vessels, even gem-encrusted swords. The royal Frankish annals describe the haul as staggering, a windfall that filled Charlemagne's coffers and fueled his empire's ambitions. But when Charlemagne died, this wealth passed to Louis, and that's where the story gets juicy. Louis didn't see the Avar treasure as a war chest for conquests or a personal piggy bank. For him, it was a divine gift, a resource to honor God by building and endowing monasteries, the spiritual backbone of his empire. Monasteries like Fulda, St. Gall, and Corbie weren't just places of prayer. They were centers of learning, culture, and political influence, preserving manuscripts and training the next generation of clergy and nobles. Louis poured his heart and his gold into them, believing that a strong church would unify his fractious empire. But here's the catch. He didn't trust his heirs to share his vision. His sons, Lothair, Pippin, and Louis the German, were already jockeying for power, their rivalries threatening to split the empire. If they got their hands on the Avar treasure, Louis feared they'd squander it on wars or personal glory, carving up the wealth like vultures over a carcass. So, he made a bold move. He hid it, locking it away in Aachen's treasury or funneling it secretly to monasteries, keeping its full extent a secret even from his closest kin. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. Louis knew his empire's unity depended on a delicate balance. His sons were ambitious, each eyeing a piece of the Carolingian pie. The 817th Ordinatio Imperii, Louis's plan to divide the empire, gave Lothair the title of co-emperor, with Pippin and Louis the German as subordinate kings. But the plan sparked resentment, and by the 820s the brothers were plotting against each other and their father. The Avar treasure was a wild card, a fortune that could tip the scales in their power struggles. Louis, ever the strategist, kept it under wraps, using it to fund his monastic projects while presenting a facade of modest piety. It was a masterclass in deception, cloaking his wealth in the guise of spiritual devotion to avoid the greed of his heirs and the scrutiny of his court. Why go to such lengths? Let's talk about the Avars and why their treasure was so special. The Avars weren't just another barbarian tribe. They were a cultural and economic powerhouse. Their Khanate, at its peak, controlled trade routes linking the Byzantine Empire with northern Europe, amassing wealth from silk, spices, and gold. Their artisans crafted intricate jewelry, like golden belt buckles inlaid with garnets, and their leaders adorned themselves with treasures rivaling those of Constantinople. When Charlemagne's armies plundered the Avar ring, they didn't just take coins. They seized relics of a civilization, chalices, crowns, even ceremonial horse tacks studded with pearls. This wasn't pocket change, it was a legacy, a symbol of triumph over a formidable foe. Louis, who'd grown up hearing tales of his father's victories, saw this treasure as more than wealth. It was a sacred trust, meant to serve a higher purpose, but hiding it wasn't easy. Aachen, the nerve center of the empire, was a hive of activity. The palace, with its marble columns and mosaic floors, was a stage for diplomacy, where envoys from Byzantium, Baghdad, and beyond mingled with Frankish nobles. Keeping a treasure hoard secret required trusted allies, chamberlains, scribes, and perhaps even monks who managed monastic endowments. Louis likely stored the bulk of the treasure in the palace treasury, a fortified vault guarded by loyal retainers. Some of it may have been dispersed to monasteries under the guise of donations, recorded vaguely to avoid suspicion. For example, the monastery of Fulda, a favorite of Louis's, received generous gifts during his reign, including land and precious objects. Were these funded by Avar gold? It's plausible. The annals of Fulda mention royal support, but don't specify sources, a silence that hints at careful bookkeeping. This secrecy wasn't unique to Louis. Rulers have always hidden their wealth to protect their power. Think of Andrew Mellon, the American tycoon of the early 20th century, who funneled his fortune into trust to dodge taxes, shielding it from government scrutiny. Or the Habsburgs, who exploited colonial wealth from the Americas, funneling silver from Potosi mines into private coffers to fund their wars and palaces. Closer to Louis's time, the Teapot Dome scandal of the 1920s saw oil magnate Edward Doheny bribe officials to secure secret leases, a modern echo of Louis's covert wealth management. These figures, like Louis, understood that wealth was power, but only if it stayed out of the wrong hands. Louis's treasure was his leverage, a way to shape the empire's future without his son's interference. The Avar treasure wasn't just gold, it was a political tool. Louis used it to strengthen the church, which was his greatest ally and his biggest watchdog. Monasteries were more than spiritual retreats. They were economic powerhouses, owning vast estates and producing everything from wine to illuminated manuscripts. By endowing them, Louis ensured their loyalty, creating a network of institutions that preached his vision of a Christian empire. But he had to be careful. The church, led by figures like Archbishop Agobard of Lyon, was quick to criticize royal excess. If Louis flaunted his wealth, he risked accusations of greed, undermining his pious image. So he played the humble king, donating to monasteries while keeping the treasure's true scale hidden. It was a tightrope walk, balancing devotion with deception. What did this treasure look like? Imagine chests overflowing with Avar craftsmanship, golden torques etched with animal motifs, silver bowls inlaid with turquoise, and coins stamped with unfamiliar runes. Archaeological finds from Avar sites like those near Székesfehérvár in Hungary reveal the sophistication of their metalwork, with intricate filigree and gemstone inlays. Some of this wealth likely ended up in Frankish hands, melted down or repurposed for Christian relics. For instance, the Tassilo chalice, a stunning 8th century artifact linked to the Carolingians, bears stylistic similarities to Avar designs, suggesting a blend of cultures. Louis might have commissioned such pieces, transforming pagan treasure into Christian symbols to legitimize his use of the hoard. Other items, like jewelry or ceremonial weapons, could have been gifted to monasteries, recorded as royal offerings to mask their origins. This story isn't just about gold, it's about a king's soul. Louis's devotion drove him to hide the treasure, believing it served a higher purpose. His monasteries, like shining beacons, preserved knowledge and faith, but they came at a cost. His sons, unaware of the hoard, grew bitter. Their rebellions in the 830 years fueled by distrust. Lothair, Pippin, and Louis the German saw their father as weak, not knowing he was guarding a fortune to secure their empire's spiritual future. The treasure was Louis's secret weapon, but also his burden, a reminder that even a pious king had to play dirty to keep his crown. Charles Martel's secret papal alliance. In the 730s in Charles Martel, the iron-fisted mayor of the palace is carving out a legacy that will echo through the ages. This is the man who stopped the Umayyad advance at the Battle of Tours in 732, earning the nickname the Hammer and a place in history as the savior of Christendom. But there's a story about Charles that's been whispered in the shadows, a secret so bold it could have shattered his fragile hold on power. We're talking about his clandestine alliance with Pope Gregory III, a pact forged in the 730s to trade military might for papal legitimacy, all hidden from the Frankish nobles who could have torn his plans apart. This isn't just a footnote in the Carolingian saga. It's a high-stakes gamble of loyalty, ambition, and cunning that links directly to the empire building of his grandson Charlemagne and the hidden wealth of his great-grandson Louis the Pious. Get ready for a tale of secret deals, sacred promises, and a warrior king who played a dangerous game to forge an empire. Let's set the stage. The Frankish kingdom in the 730s is a chaotic patchwork of tribes and warlords, loosely united under the Merovingian kings, who are little more than figureheads. Charles Martel, as mayor of the palace, holds the real power, commanding armies and pulling the strings behind the throne. He's a battle-hardened leader, fresh off his victory at Tours, where he halted the Muslim advance into Europe, cementing his reputation as a defender of the faith. But his power isn't secure. The Frankish nobles, proud, land-hungry, and fiercely independent, watch his every move, ready to rebel if he oversteps. Across the Alps, the Lombard kingdom in Italy is flexing its muscles, threatening the Papal States and putting Pope Gregory III in a bind. The Pope needs a champion, and Charles needs legitimacy to solidify his rule. Enter their secret alliance, a deal that would reshape the future of Europe, but had to be kept under wraps to avoid a noble uprising. This pact wasn't just a handshake, it was a calculated exchange. Pope Gregory III, facing Lombard aggression, sent envoys to Charles around 739 offering a deal: Frankish military aid to protect the Papal States in exchange for papal endorsement, a spiritual stamp of approval that would elevate Charles's status from warlord to God's chosen ruler. This wasn't a small ask. The Lombards, under King Liutprand, were a formidable force, raiding papal territories and eyeing Rome itself. Gregory, desperate for a strong ally, saw Charles as his best bet. For Charles, the Pope's blessing was a golden ticket. It would give him divine legitimacy, silencing critics among the nobles and paving the way for his family, the Carolingians, to claim the throne. But the deal had to stay secret. The Frankish elite were wary of foreign entanglements, especially with a distant pope who might meddle in their affairs. If they caught wind of Charles pledging troops to Italy, they could have revolted, fracturing the fragile unity he'd fought to maintain. Why was this alliance such a big deal? Let's break it down. Charles Martel wasn't a king, he was a mayor, a powerful administrator who'd clawed his way to dominance through battles and cunning. His victories, like Tours, made him a hero, but they didn't erase the fact that he was technically a servant of the Merovingian dynasty. The nobles, who controlled vast estates and private armies, saw him as an upstart, and many resented his growing influence. To secure his power, Charles needed more than swords. He needed legitimacy, the kind only the church could provide. The Pope, as the spiritual leader of Western Christendom, held unmatched authority. A papal alliance would cast Charles as a defender of the faith, aligning him with God's will and giving him a moral edge over his rivals. It was the first step toward the Carolingian Dynasty, which his son Pippin the Short would formalize in 751 by deposing the last Merovingian king with papal approval. The deal itself was a masterstroke of diplomacy. Gregory III sent gifts, relics, perhaps a fragment of the true cross and keys to St. Peter's tomb, symbolizing a sacred bond. In return, Charles promised military support, likely committing to send Frankish troops or resources to counter the Lombards. This wasn't a full-scale invasion. Charles was too busy consolidating power in Francia to march south. Instead, he likely offered strategic aid, cavalry units, supplies, or even a show of force to deter Liutprand. The Liber Pontificalis, a papal biography, hints at this exchange, noting Gregory's outreach to the Franks and his urgent pleas for help. But the details are scarce, and that's no accident. Both Charles and Gregory knew the alliance had to stay quiet. If the Frankish nobles learned their leader was diverting resources to a foreign pope, they'd see it as betrayal, a sign he valued Rome over their interests. The secrecy was as crucial as the pact itself. This wasn't just about politics, it was personal. Charles was a devout Christian, raised in a world where faith and power were intertwined. His victory at Tours wasn't just a military win, it was framed as a divine triumph, proof that God favored him. Aligning with the Pope deepened this narrative, but it also put him in a tricky spot. The Frankish church, led by bishops like Boniface, was pushing for reform, and they wanted Charles to be a model Christian leader. A public alliance with the Pope could have raised expectations, forcing Charles to cede more control to the clergy. By keeping the pact secret, he maintained his independence while reaping the benefits. It was a tightrope walk, balancing faith, ambition, and survival in a cutthroat world. The stakes were enormous. The Frankish kingdom was a powder keg, with rival factions like the Neustrians and Austrasians vying for dominance. Charles had spent years uniting them through conquests, like his campaigns against the Saxons and Frisians, and strategic marriages, like his son Pippin's union with Bertrada of Leon. But unity was fragile. The nobles, many descended from ancient Gallo-Roman families, jealously guarded their autonomy. They'd supported Charles against external threats, but a foreign alliance could have pushed them over the edge. Across the Alps, the Lombards were a growing menace, their raids on papal lands threatening to destabilize Italy. If Charles failed to act, he risked losing the Pope's favor, but if he acted openly, he risked rebellion at home. The secret alliance was his way out, a clandestine deal that let him play both sides. This kind of covert pact wasn't unique to Charles. Rulers have always made secret deals to secure power. Take the Hohenzollern dynasty in the 19th century, who struck clandestine naval arms deals with Britain to bolster their Prussian fleet, keeping it quiet to avoid antagonizing France. Or the Bourbons during the Spanish Inquisition, funneling funds to the church to crush heretics while hiding the scale of their involvement to maintain diplomatic ties. Even in the 20th century, financier J.P. Morgan brokered secret arms deals during World War I, supplying the Allies while publicly claiming neutrality. Charles's alliance with Gregory III fits this pattern, a hidden agreement to gain an edge, concealed to avoid backlash. Like these later figures, Charles understood that power often lies in what you don't say. Let's connect this to the Carolingian legacy. Charles's pact laid the groundwork for his grandson Charlemagne's empire, who, as we know, hid his own secrets, like his pagan Saxon concubines, to protect his dynasty. Charlemagne's coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 800 was a direct descendant of Charles's papal ties, a relationship that gave the Carolingians divine legitimacy. And Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son, inherited this knack for secrecy, stashing away the Avar treasure to fund monasteries while keeping it from his squabbling heirs. Charles Martel was the pioneer, the first to see the church as a partner in power, and his secret alliance with Gregory III was the spark that lit the Carolingian flame. This story isn't just about a deal, it's about a man who changed history. Charles Martel's alliance with Pope Gregory III was a turning point, the moment the Carolingians tied their fate to the church. It gave Charles the legitimacy to dominate Francia, paving the way for Pippin's coronation and Charlemagne's empire. It also set a precedent for secrecy, seen in Charlemagne's hidden concubines and Louis's Avar treasure. The cost was high. Charles risked rebellion, strained his nobles' loyalty, and bore the weight of a secret that could have undone him. Picture him in his final years, gazing over the Loire, wondering if his pact was worth it. His sons, his people, his God, they all demanded his allegiance, and he gave it, but at a price.